Thank you all for coming out today during your lunchtime, and thank you, Buffy, for inviting me to speak today. I also just want to give a thank you to our beloved Heidi, who first introduced me to ACE last year when I hadn't quite gotten all of my bearings, and so her presence is greatly missed and greatly appreciated throughout my time here. Today I would like to talk to you all about some of the work that has been particularly interesting to me, and by way of this presentation, How Do You See Me? The Effects of Stereotyping on Black Women in an Electoral Context. And so I'll kind of give you a sense of kind of my research questions, and then a bit of background on exactly how it is that I've come to asking these questions, and why it even matters in the first place. So the first question is, how are Black female political candidates perceived in terms of their trait stereotypes, their ideologies, and electability, right? That's the whole idea of becoming a political candidate. You want to get elected to office. But people have to evaluate you first and then determine whether they think that you should be able to hold that office. The second question that I have that is related is, are Black female candidates perceived differently based on variations in their skin tones? And so the way that I go about doing this, and I'll talk about this when I get to my research and methods section, is by way of experimental survey research. And so we'll talk about that in a moment. But I want to talk about why it even matters, right? Why should we talk about Black female candidates in general? One of the things that we know about our system, that I always talk to my students about in American government classes, is that we are part of a representative democracy. And so we want to ensure that we can actually have a legitimate democracy by way of ensuring that everyone gets to participate and to get their interests heard and understood in some way. And so it's important for us to know who it is that holds office and who perhaps may be more or less likely to be elected to office. Now this comes down to issues as well of descriptive and substantive representation. So descriptive representation being, does the person that represents you have some sort of characteristics in common with you, whether it has to do with certain salient identities, such as race, gender, class, region, religion, so forth. But then when we come to substantive representation, this is the actual representation of people's interests. Right? And so we can see some sort of lining up here. We would hope and presume that if someone looks like you, perhaps they are more likely to represent your interests, but that's not always necessarily the case, right? However, what a lot of the extant literature has demonstrated is that there is value to descriptive representation, not just at the point of voting, once you get through all of the legislation and getting the bills created and getting to that final vote. It's not so much once you get to that point, but when you start the process of creating legislation. So specifically, the agenda setting process, right? So people who look more like you by way of this descriptive representation are more likely to actually put forward some sort of agenda items on things that are of interest to you. So that's a part of why it's important to think about various places on this intersection between race and gender in terms of identities of political candidates. So we also have to think about the ways in which perhaps stereotypes may come into play here, right? So we would generally hope that people are being, or at least candidates are being evaluated on their own merits, as compared to what people see in front of them and the stereotypes that they then connect to them, right? Because our identities don't necessarily mean a whole lot outside of the context of the meaning that society places on those, right? So what is race without some sort of meaning attached to it? What is gender without some sort of social meaning written onto it? So this can have a very direct influence on the political outcomes that we see when we think about the social perceptions that exist. And then, again, I'm very interested in issues of identity politics, but unfortunately, the way that we have often examined this, at least in political science, and we're starting to move away from this now, but we've often examined this on a one-dimensional level. Okay? And so it's not as though we only have one identity that's connected to ourselves as individuals, right? I'm a woman, I'm also black, I'm also a mother, I'm also a political scientist, and these things all come together in various ways that need to be examined more broadly. So, in terms of thinking of electoral politics, we have to kind of start with issues of candidate evaluation, right? So how do the people who are likely to go out to vote, how do they then actually perceive the candidates that are in front of them in some way? So the views that people hold, obviously, are then going to have some sort of influence on the electoral outcomes. If you view someone positively, you're more likely to vote for them. And again, we want to get a sense of whether people are evaluating candidates just based on what they see in front of them and the meanings that are attached to what they see, or whether perhaps it has to do with something more policy related. And we also want to get a sense of what types of policies people may be more likely to connect to specific intersections of race and gender. So in terms of stereotypes, I always like to start with definitions, right? So that we can all be on the same page and then move forward from there. So according to Schneider from 2005, stereotypes are qualities perceived to be associated with particular groups or categories of people. I use this particular definition because it's very broad. Right, so often when we think about stereotyping, we're thinking in terms of very negative ideas that are connected and associated with people, rather than just more broadly what ideas and meanings are attached to particular groups, right? And so what we know about stereotypes is that just because something sounds positive doesn't mean that it is positive for the people that that particular stereotype is being placed upon, right? And so when we're stereotyping, we're not seeing people as individuals, right? We're seeing them as a part of a group that then has one or other particular characteristics. So various things that we know about stereotypes in politics. We know that they can directly influence how people see political candidates. And we also know, and this is very interesting, that these stereotypes, even when they are disagreed with or completely pushed aside, can then activate other stereotypes. So if you may say, well, I don't think of blacks as unintelligent. By way of starting to think in terms of stereotypes in that way, it starts to activate other stereotypes that are associated with race when people are thinking about evaluating political candidates. So even if you've completely kind of disregarded certain stereotypes, others start to come into play in terms of how you may evaluate candidates. So, as I said, I like to kind of define things. When we talk about politics and stereotypes, we, particularly by way of Huddy and Turkleson, divide them into various categories. And especially here we're thinking of belief stereotypes and trait stereotypes. Now, belief stereotypes generally have to do with ideologies, right? Generally in American politics, we think liberal versus conservative. Now, I don't really like that particular way of doing this. I feel like it leaves out a lot to be described. And so one of the ways that I try to cut across that, but it's not a perfect measure either, is to separate out types of ideologies on specific issues. So usually we ask a 7-point scale question, a Likert scale question. Are you how liberal to conservative do you see yourself as being? Right. So 1 is extremely liberal, 7 is extremely conservative, and you place yourself somewhere in between there, with 4 being moderate. But what I do is I use this scale, but then I ask the question about social issues, right? So when you're thinking about social issues such as abortion or the death penalty or gay marriage, right? Like, where do you place yourself on that scale in terms of liberal to conservative as compared to economic issues? And so I'll ask that question again, saying how do you see yourself or how do you perceive a candidate on this scale? And so that will have to, and then I'll give examples of government spending or tax policy and things like that. And so you tend to begin to get a little bit of a different picture about what belief stereotypes people think should be attached to certain individuals. And then we also have this issue of, when we're thinking about stereotypes, again, where people place candidates in terms of whether they think that people are competent for handling particular types of policy. And so, generally speaking, when you're going to be addressing issues of race, then perhaps you're going to think, well, this person may be more competent on issues of civil rights. And so, if you're approaching this from some sort of black-white dichotomy, and so this goes for issues relating to the intersection of race and gender as well, which we'll get to in a moment. So, general stereotypes that we find in the literature with regards to blacks are that they're lazy, violent, unintelligent, and irresponsible. Right? And so these are all negative in nature. Right? But then when we think about women, again, we have stereotypes, but they're not necessarily going to be seen as negative. Some of them are. It often will depend on the context, right? So women are often stereotyped as being passive, nurturing, and compassionate, trustworthy, warm, and dependable. But when you compare these, for both of these dimensions, to what the ideal political candidate is, you can see some overlap and some differentiation, right? So an ideal political candidate is assertive, is trustworthy, right? So we do see some connection there in terms of women. Empathetic, another connection here. Ethical, and generally competent. And so again, we want to get a sense of how this all ends up coming together. Now, this is where the problems arise, as I was saying with regards to identity politics. We often are looking at one identity at a time, and partially because it's hard to figure out how to go about examining more than one. So that's one issue, the difficulty that we find in doing that. And the other is that we have these prototypes in our heads about what does it mean when I'm thinking about one gender, or when I'm thinking about class, or any of those types of things. We think, oh, well, if we're thinking race, or we're thinking specifically black here, then black male is kind of the prototype that pops into people's heads. If you're thinking woman, white female is the first thing that kind of pops in, the first image that generally will pop into people's heads. And that's how we often think about issues of identity. However, it's important to recognize that there are intersections between identities. So when I think about intersectional identity, I have a bit of a broader view of this than a lot of what you find within the literature, because generally when we speak of intersectional identity, we're only talking about multiple subordinate identities. And while that's what I'm doing today, I think of the intersection specifically of race and gender, or race, ethnicity, and gender as being an actual intersection, right? So if you're taking this black-white dichotomy and male-female that we generally talk about, right? That's generally how in the past we have addressed this concept of gender. That's four groupings, right? So you have white male, white female, black male, black female, that all fit into what we can consider an intersection of race and gender. And so we want to get a sense of how people view individuals at each of these intersections, right? Because then we get a better sense of how candidates are evaluated at these intersections, if there's a specific way that stereotypes may come in, right? We can't make the assumption automatically that it's there, but you want to test to see if there's something that you can find there. Now, that having been said, I take that broader view. However, again, because we do not often study these intersections of multiple subordinate identities, it's important to begin pushing forward on that type of work. Now, there's very little extant literature on this, specifically in terms of political candidates, but we have, by way of Gordon and Miller from 2005, begun to develop some of our understandings of the stereotypes that reside here, including the idea that Black female candidates are seen as a little bit more knowledgeable than other candidates and more capable. So these were some of the results that they ended up finding at that point. Now, what do you see here? Hoping you see something. Okay, good. I hear it.
Skin color.
Skin color. Exactly.
Say it again.
Skin color and variations on tone.
Thank you.
Anything else?
Somewhat racially ambiguous.
Somewhat racially ambiguous. Okay, so, and I don't, this is probably, okay, great. Let me turn here. So, there are a few things here, right? There's so much that we could unpack, and we're not going a great deal into
It's just all day on this.
Yes, exactly. We could spend all day talking about this. So, for one,
I see light skin. I see light skin. So they're telling me that the lighter skin is better.
right, exactly. So this is an ad for a bleaching cream, right? That's being targeted toward Black women, saying, hey, you know, you would just be so much more beautiful, you'd be so much more happy, and men will flock to you if you have lighter skin, and we can do something about that. We will help you out, right? And then you can also see, by way of Beyonce and Jay-Z, right? This color differential, not to say that, you know, he is necessarily seeking out somebody who has a lighter skin tone. However, what we do know is that, particularly for Black women, a lighter skin tone is something that has been highly valued, particularly in terms of some sort of attractiveness. Right? And what you can see from Simba and Nala is that this is something that gets written into our popular culture, and something that is specifically geared toward children. So from very early, these messages are things that are being sent out in very subtle types of ways. And it's not as though this is only by way of Simba and Nala. I was watching Alpha and Omega, which is this strange wolf story, right? Exactly. Yeah, they get shorter over time, thankfully.
But it's usually gendered as well, right?
So absolutely. So
it is an Egyptian art.
Right, exactly. And this is something that we see broadly across races often, but especially when we're talking about non-white women in terms of their attractiveness to men. Right? And again, with Alpha and Omega, you see that the female wolf is much lighter than the male wolf, and she's the one that he's seeking in some way. So this brings us into the issue.
Can we go back?
I'm sorry?
Can we go back to that slide?
Sammy Sosa?
What? That's Sammy Sosa?
This is Sammy Sosa.
Wow.
So,
Oh boy.
Wow.
when he left
It's not funny.
Oh, really?
Major League Baseball, relatively soon after that, there was a very clear change in his appearance. And as you can see, he has, and he's finally admitted to it, he's been bleaching his skin with a special cream. And you may be able to tell as well that he has straightened his hair and he has it slicked back, right? So if you look at older pictures of Sammy Sosa, you know, his hair is a different texture. And so this, again, it kind of begins to demonstrate, again, the valuation, not just of specific skin tones, but also phenotypic traits. So in terms of thinking about how this has some sort of influence, right? We're talking about issues of race, we're talking about issues of gender, but we also have the issue of colorism that gets written onto this as well. And so again, by way of some sort of definition, colorism is defined as discrimination and prejudicial judgments based on gradations of skin color and physical features. Right? And so there's a favoring of lighter complexions over darker complexions. And a lot of the literature on this is not in politics, but it is related to social issues. And so this is something that has been seen to have socioeconomic effects. In my graduate study, I was working within archives, and I was able to help to process some of the archives for North Carolina Mutual, which is the largest and first Black-owned insurance company from like 1898, and it's still in service today. And when you look back at the pictures of the founders of the wives, they all had a very, very light skin tone. But the founders themselves did not necessarily, right? And so even there you can see that from very early on we have this valuation that's going on in terms of searching for spouses and things of that nature that then have an effect on socioeconomic status. But we don't know a lot about what this means for politics, if anything, right? Because we can't necessarily go into it asking, well, what is the effect that colorism has, but rather, does colorism have some sort of influence here? And the few studies that have been done, are specific to Black male candidates in terms of differences in skin tone. And so I want to extend this or expand this specifically to Black women in an electoral context. And by way of further defining colorism, in order to make it a little bit clearer, it's not as though it is in some way mutually exclusive when we think about issues of racism, right? So basically, it's the idea that you have perhaps issues of racism where color then gets added onto it, right? Or as Veshla Weaver says, colorism can operate independently from racism. Two people in the same racial group can experience different treatment by complexion while both being subject to discrimination by race. And so you get these different things that happen, but all on the same plane.
Who was on the State of Things last month talking about colorism?
Oh,
Like, there was a
I'm
whole
sure.
feature, half an hour. I'll figure it out. I thought it might be your mentor, or you, because I didn't hear the
Oh,
answer.
no, well, it wasn't me. Yes, it wasn't me. So one of the things that has been found in the literature is that, interestingly, when you're looking at skin tone in an electoral context, again with these males, people are less likely to be monitoring themselves in terms of issues of race and how they respond when there's a lighter skin tone. So what appears to be happening is that when there's a darker skin tone, people automatically say, oh, wait, I'm being asked about issues of race. Let me be careful, perhaps, about how I respond, right? And so, or at least this is how this has been interpreted, and how I interpret some of my results as well. But that doesn't necessarily mean the same thing when you're actually getting to the point of electability and how people perceive candidates in terms of their skin tone. Because you can evaluate someone in a particular way, but then decide about your support on a different planar level. So, in terms of how I approached this issue in terms of questions or the hypotheses that I had. First, in terms of candidate evaluation, I hypothesized that the Black female candidates would be viewed as more socially and economically liberal, right? Because generally speaking, we see women as more liberal than men, Blacks as more liberal than whites, and this would be some sort of multiplicative effect that we would see. Additionally, I hypothesized that Black female candidates would be seen as more trustworthy and compassionate than their opponents, specifically because of some of the findings from the earlier literature, including my own work where I was looking at how elite individuals at these four intersections were being perceived. And elites specifically because, let me back up to that, we don't know a lot about stereotypes at the intersection of race and gender specifically. And if we're thinking forward toward how that might influence political candidates, you're generally going to want to ask people about how they perceive elites as compared to the average person from a group, right? Because elites are seen as more like, or so elites are defined as people who are the most successful economically and socially within a particular group. And so there's a very big differentiation between how Black elites are seen as compared to the average Black person, right? And so I asked questions about how do you see the average person, how do you see an elite individual for each of these four groups at this, this limited intersection. And then thirdly, for candidate evaluation, I posited that Black female candidates would be rated higher than their opponents, so the people that they're running against, on race and gender related issues in terms of their competence for their issues. So not comparing two Black women of different skin tones, but comparing a Black woman to the person that she's running against. Now, in terms of skin tone, I had several hypotheses as well. The first is that in comparison to one another, the light-skinned Black female candidates would be rated lower on trait and competency issues than dark-skinned Black female candidates. Again, relating back to that self-monitoring issue for the people that are, for people who say that they would be likely to vote, right? Are they saying, well, I don't want to evaluate the darker-skinned Black woman negatively because that would mean that I'm saying something bad about race? Now, the second part is that in comparison to their opponents, the light-skinned Black female candidates would be rated more positively on trait and particular non-Black, non-female policy issues as compared to the darker-skinned Black females, right? So basically they would be seen as pretty competent as compared to somebody who, again, is kind of drawing on a little bit more strongly some of the more negative stereotypes regarding Black folks. Okay. So, and then lastly, light-skinned Black women would perform better electorally than darker-skinned Black women. So this isn't so much a racial self-monitoring issue, but who is it that you think that you could feel good about supporting? And here I would suggest that there's a colorism issue happening here. Okay, so how did I collect the data? I conducted a survey and mock election back in February of 2012 that was distributed online, and it had a nationally representative sample. And so I designed this in order to be able to gather information on stereotypes regarding Black female candidates and to examine the degree to which skin color is actually activating the use of stereotypes. So I began by way of, in terms of the survey itself, I began by way of asking questions about affect, because this is a separate side of the ideas that I'm interested in terms of how is it that you feel today, or how do you feel about your economic situation or about the political situation? How does your affect influence who you are going to support? And then I ran the two mock elections. So there are two sets here, and each individual respondent will have to go through two candidate evaluations. One with a lighter-skinned Black female who's running against one of three candidates: a white male, white female, or a Black male. And then there's a second set where there's a darker-skinned Black female who's running against, once again, a white male, a white female, or a Black male. And the order in which you get this is randomly distributed. So some people will get the person with the darker skin tone first, and then the lighter skin tone after that. Okay, and so then I asked various questions having to do with racial resentment and modern sexism, as well as gathering demographic information on the respondents. So I'll show you what these mock elections look like. So the first one, we have a relatively lighter-skinned Black female running against a white male. So for each of these sets, again, I had about 335 respondents, and then they were separated out into one of these three groups: white male, white female, or Black male. So there are a little over 100 respondents for each of these elections. And what you see here is a picture and a name. right? They're both relatively straightforward, like Anglo-type names. Their education is relatively similar. Their occupations are relatively on the same level. Same with the types of organizations they're involved in and the length of their political careers. Because I wanted to keep everything, I wanted to have as few moving parts as possible. I wanted the only thing that's changing among these groups to be the race and the gender of the opponent. Right? So they're all running against this one black female candidate. In the second mock election, there's a woman with a darker skin tone as compared to the first woman. And again, this is a different white male, white female, black male because everybody's seeing the same two elections. And so I can't use the exact same opponents. And so again, I tried to keep education, occupation, and so forth all the same. And then I had very benign, broad statements about how, from both of the candidates, about how they support the United States and the political system and how they're very excited to work for everyone, right? So nothing that would indicate policy. Because again, I just want to get a sense of where people perceive these individuals to be based on no information that they are giving about themselves and their political stances. So going through those hypotheses. We start with ideology, right? So how are these individuals being perceived? And what you should be able to see here, again, we have this 7-point scale with the lower numbers, or starting with 1 being liberal, going all the way up to 7 being conservative. And so what you can see here is that the black female candidate with the lighter complexion, was seen as more socially liberal than any of her opponents. And this is statistically significant when she's running against the white male and the black male, but not statistically significant when she's running against the white female. And so here, perhaps you're seeing a little bit more of a differentiation along the lines of gender as compared to race. Now, when we look at the woman with the darker complexion, again we see some sort of support for this hypothesis that the black female candidate again is being seen as more socially liberal, but it's only a statistically significant difference when we're looking at the black male versus the black female. And so perhaps here we're seeing a little bit more of a differentiation along the lines of race, again, which is interesting to consider when you're thinking about the differences of skin tone. Perhaps there's some sort of connection in that way. With regard to economic ideology, again, we see that the black female candidate with the lighter complexion is seen as more economically liberal. So again, tax policy, government spending, and so forth. We do see statistical significance again for the races between the white male and the black male, and we're very close to what we would normally see as statistical significance when we're looking at the white female versus the black female. And then finally, we're thinking here of economic ideology and a darker complexion. There's a little bit less of a differentiation that's being placed in here. With the only statistically significant difference, again, being along that racial line, where it's that people are only differentiating the black male as compared to the black female, rather than saying, that black female, she's very different on issues of economic ideology as compared to this white male candidate or the white female candidate, which again, perhaps could be connected to that racial self-monitoring. If you're comparing two people of the same race, then you don't necessarily feel as uncomfortable about making these differentiations. So this moves us to traits and trait stereotypes specifically. These traits are often connected to, again, some sort of ideal political candidate in terms of where they stand on issues of ethics or being assertive in some way, right? Traits that we want to see in our candidates. And so here I have an aggregate of the opponent, because again, the only thing that's changing with the opponents is their race and their gender. So what you see, if I can get this to, okay, what you see here with the individual with lighter skin is that she's only being seen as, when we take a difference of the means, right, the mean scores, she's only being seen as definitively less assertive than her opponents, more intelligent, and less trustworthy, which is kind of going against some of the literature on this issue. Usually they're seen as perhaps more trustworthy and competent. However, when we take a look at these traits with regards to the individual with a darker complexion, we see that she's being seen as less compassionate, less cooperative, less ethical, and less trustworthy than her opponent, right? Than the person that she's running against. However, what's really interesting to look at here is if I can get this to, is the actual averages that we can see. So if you take a look at the averages for the woman with the lighter complexion as compared to the averages with the woman with the darker complexion, you can see that all of these averages here are just a tiny bit higher, but they're all higher. Right? So what this suggests to me is that when people are in this race and they're examining these individuals, in spite of the fact that they're viewing that woman as less compassionate, less cooperative, and so forth, they're not placing her particularly far down, they're just placing other people a little bit higher, right? So I see her as less compassionate than her opponent, but as compared to what they had done earlier, or perhaps afterwards when they're evaluating the lighter skinned candidate, they don't as much care about this differentiation. I don't have to say something really great about somebody with this different skin tone, because again, that racial marker is not coming out in as strong of a way.
Do you think that might have also been an occupation difference?
Yes. So this is something that comes in terms of how to evaluate overall the results, because and when I move forward with trying to take a look at this again, and when I would like to add more racial differences and ethnic differences, what I would do differently would be to have everyone have the same occupation, to take out any of the names of the schools that people went to. So I worked to get universities that were generally on the same par, and this is a nationally representative survey, so people are coming from different places, but there may be people who say, oh, I really hate UNC, and so I'm gonna, push back against that in some way. And so, to take out some of
I went to
those.
I went to Duke for undergrad on scholarship.
My husband and I were at UNC at Duke at the same time, so.
Yeah, they're both excellent schools.
Exactly.
Reading in particular might cause some people to think,
Yeah.
right? They come with a lot of
So one person
value.
did more medical related stuff, and the other one did more juridical or stuff, and so I was already liking the medical person a little more, like more fair.
Right, exactly. So that's interesting for when we get to the results of the elections themselves. Okay, so but yes, I think that there can be some sort of differentiation in spite of the fact that we have these professional levels for occupations. Okay, so in terms of competency, right, like which issues are you most competent on? Again, we see some sort of differentiation. For the lighter black female, she was seen as more competent on issues of civil rights. less competent on the economy, right? So something that's generally not seen as a race or gender issue. And unless you're specifically thinking of, some sort of strength on the economy for males. She's more competent in terms of ethics, less competent in terms of jobs and the military, and more competent in terms of issues concerning welfare. So here, you can see some sort of differentiation saying, well, I don't really think that she's as competent as her competitor, right? Again, we have no real policy differentiation that's being placed forward. But I think that she's less competent when we think about security and economy, right? But, she's going to do great on those racial issues or, welfare, which is, some sort of particularly intersection between race and gender. When we get over to our second set, again, we do see on what is this intersectional dimension, generally speaking, in our society, that the darker black female is seen as more competent on welfare, but nothing else. And so in a statistically significant way, she's seen as less competent on the economy as compared to her opponent, less competent on ethics, immigration, jobs, and security, and the military. And so, again, competing against somebody who is a lawyer perhaps may have some sort of influence, but doesn't necessarily need to lead to this sort of differentiation in terms of, say, the economy, right? Or necessarily in terms of issues of ethics. Generally speaking, many people might think that it would be the opposite way around, that the person who's the lawyer would not necessarily be seen as being as ethical as a pediatric surgeon, right? But that's not what ends up happening here. So, okay, here we go. So in terms of these hypotheses, the first with regards to ideology is supported, right? The black female candidates were seen as more socially and economically liberal, which is generally kind of expected and fairly straightforward. The idea that the black females would be seen as more trustworthy and compassionate was not something, well, it wasn't that it wasn't supported, it was refuted, right? So they were not seen in this electoral context, right? In this mock electoral context as being more trustworthy or compassionate, which is in the opposite direction of some of the literature on this. And then there's some partial support for this idea that they're going to be rated higher on issues that they're generally going to be seen as more competent on, like education, because that's often seen as a woman's issue, or civil rights or welfare. So what does this look like when we get to the point of elections? So in terms of again, some sort of issue of colorism and lighter complexion, we see that the lighter black female won all of her races, like all three of these different races that are occurring at the same time, which is what you see on the left here, right? So people saying, I would vote for this individual. And again, and this is something that I would like to reiterate, right? Like there may be something about this candidate that is appealing more as not by way of her race or her gender, but by way of the description, right? That's appealing more to the respondents. However, we do see some differences in terms of the degree to which people are willing to vote for her. So they're relatively even, but she's all a little bit under 60% in terms of support for her. In terms of whether people were saying that she was electable, right? So not only like would you vote for her, but do you think that other people would vote for this individual, right? Who is it that you think would be more likely to be seen as electable? Again, she's seen as more electable, a little bit less so in the same gender race. So then what does the other race look like, right? Again, there may be something about that other candidate that seems much more as though there's a connection between you and that person, or you may think that that person's going to really do a great job, like that opponent will do a really great job in political office. However, we're seeing again that the darker female candidate is not winning any of these races. And this is where you start to get some sort of differentiation as compared to the last slide. So the white female candidate is much more likely to have won this race as compared to either of the males, but they still do, perform very strongly as compared to this woman. However, if you look at electability, there's much more differentiation here. Right, so it's not just, oh, like, I would vote for her, but I don't really necessarily think that other people would vote for her. And so again, you have that issue of colorism that's coming out there where people are saying, well, she's not electable, but of course I would do it, right? Because of this perhaps issue of some sort of racial self-monitoring, but to a lesser degree because they're still not saying I would definitely vote for her. So when she's running against the white candidates, she does, in terms of this idea of electability, she does very poorly, and only slightly less poorly when running against the black male. So, and again, and that connects again to that idea of there's something about these candidates that's being seen as different. And so if we can kind of draw out some of that differentiation, then we can perhaps see whether there are some other differences. But again, this issue of electability is still suggesting that there's a skin tone issue that's going on here that we have to kind of work our way through. So each of these hypotheses on skin tone is supported in terms of the ideas that when compared to when we look at each of these candidates, the woman with the darker skin tone is not ending up doing as well in terms of trait and competency issues. I'm sorry, the other way around, that the woman with the lighter skin tone, right, had those averages that were a little bit lower than the woman with the darker skin tone because of that racial self-monitoring. I don't want to say something really bad about or seen as in some way being racist, right? But, and that's not to say that people don't see issues of race when they see lighter skin tones, but perhaps it's less obvious that, hey, somebody's trying to ask me something about race right now while I'm taking this survey. And so then in terms of the policy competency, we do see that the black female with the lighter skin tone was rated more positively on issues that had to do with or that were not seen as policies for black people or for women. And then finally, there was a difference in terms of their performance at the electoral level that you especially then see when you think about issues of electability. And so basically we can see here that intersectionality is something that actually is coming into play in some way because you see differences in these mock elections between, so when you take one set, you see differences in how people are evaluating each of these different elections, right? Each of these different candidates. So the black male and the black female have a different way of being evaluated as compared to the black female and the white male together and so forth. And so that's how you can see that there are things that are happening here in terms of the assignment of stereotypes and then the influence of that assignment at the electoral level. And in terms of issues relating to, again, those ideologies, black women are seen as more liberal and on social and economic issues, which then can have an influence in terms of actual electoral politics, right? So if you are running for, if you're running as a Democrat, then you're going to be more likely than to be seen as particularly liberal. Perhaps in a primary election that would be useful for you, because we know that primary voters are more likely to be on the outsides of their ideological spectrums, and then when you run in the general, that's why we see people coming to the middle, right? But if you're running as a Republican, then people are more likely to see you as much more moderate in terms of your conservatism, because they're automatically seeing you as more liberal than somebody else at these different intersections of race and gender. Now, we can't really say a lot about what that means in terms of when people actually start talking about their policy. But that has interesting implications for how people will go about running their campaigns to demonstrate that they do connect to these stereotypes, or perhaps that they need to kind of push back against them. And then we talked about issues of policy competence, but one thing that I'd like to highlight is that the woman with a darker complexion was only seen as more competent on issues of welfare among the issues that I asked about. Right? And there were several issues that when you look at statistical significance, she was seen as less competent on. And so that again has some sort of implications with regards to that intersection of race and gender, but also how color begins to have some sort of influence here. And then we see differences in terms of electability and electoral prospects just more generally in terms of differences of skin tone. Now, moving forward, there are lots of directions to go with this. One of the things that I'm interested in looking at now is kind of whether and how people try to combat these stereotypes that they know exist, right? If you can ask people, how bossy do you think this individual is? Or how bossy do you think that society thinks black women are? Or how intelligent do you think black women are? How intelligent do you think society thinks black women are? Then that means that we all have a sense of where society stands on these issues. And so the people running for office know where society stands on how they view that individual, right? And so given that you know to some degree the stereotypes that people hold, then perhaps as a candidate you work to push back against that. And so that's what I'm working toward looking into as I go forward with regards to taking a look at actual races as compared to just what we can do in some sort of experimental or mock election scenario. And then I would also like to take a look at when I can get larger sample sizes, the differences among respondents, and whether there's any sort of lineup with regards to their own intersectional identities, whether having to do with their policy positions or just very specifically the identity groups that they belong to. And as I said earlier, I have a much broader view of intersectionality than what some of the literature, and particularly in politics, works toward examining. And so I would like to kind of broaden that out more in terms of other ethnicities and races and so forth. And so, thank you.